Okay, good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be together as we kick off our Modern Jewish Thinkers Summer Series. I think this is the third year, and our goal is to expose each other to contemporary Jewish thinkers of all kinds. We really define this term as broadly as possible, and in particular to gain access to people whose thought and ideas and writings we might not otherwise get a chance to see, and especially people of really the current moment who are part of the ongoing conversation of Jewish life and Jewish thought in our world today. Um, I'm so delighted to be sharing with you some of the thought and writing of Harav Ilay Ofran. I'm going to begin to say a few words about his bio in a moment and what we're going to do, but I'll just preface it by commenting that our Modern Jewish Thought series, Modern Jewish Thinkers series in the classroom format differs a little bit from our regular Thursday morning class. Our regular Thursday morning class with me is more of a dialogue. We read a little bit of text. We have lots of conversation and discussion about it, continue on to a little more text. And I'm a little bit more controlling of the frontal nature of the presentations in the summer series, only for the reason that it's so hard to give a glimpse into someone's thought and writing in only an hour, and now a little bit less than an hour. So we're really going to work through a whole bunch of text, a longer set of readings than we typically get through in an hour. And I'm going to attempt to guide us through reading some texts and offering some framing comments about them. It won't really leave much time for questions and conversation, so my apologies about that in advance. But I'm always happy to chat with you afterwards or separately about your thoughts and reactions to Harav Ilay Ofran in this case and his thought. Before I share the sources and start to discuss, I want to say a word about how I came to Harav Ilay and what his thought and his voice in modern Israeli society and Jewish life means to me. I became acquainted with Harav Ilay, I think, through a variety of connections. One is through YCT. YCT, our rabbinical school, Rav Avi's rabbinical school, now our president and Rosh HaYeshiva, Rabbi Dov Linzer, and where I'm a graduate from YCT's class of 2009, has in the last 4 or 5 years opened a program called Rikma, which means fabric, and it kind of speaks to the interweaving of American and Israeli Jewish communities. Rikma is a program which brings YCT's flavor of Jewish teaching and rabbinic and pastoral leadership to Israeli rabbis and community leaders. And it brings them to the States for an opportunity to learn about American Judaism and runs programming for them in Israel. For them, the typical Israeli rabbinic training in Israel is very focused on halacha, on Jewish law, and has less of pastoral, psychological training, what we call practical rabbinics, and things like that, community leadership. There is now a growing market of those kinds of supplementary programs. But when you get rabbinic ordination in Israel, typically you take a battery of tests that are offered from the Israeli chief rabbinate on a set of areas of halacha, and the broader concept of rabbinic training is less present. And we believe that YCT does a great job of training rabbis and wanted to share that with our Israeli colleagues. And the person who was chosen to sort of head the Israeli side of Rikma is Harav Ilay Ofran. So he has come to the States, over the last number of years on these annual trips. Of course, they visit HIR, and we've gotten a chance to get to know each other a little bit. And on a trip a few years ago, he presented me with a copy of his book, Drushim, which has two little teachings on the weekly parsha for each parsha. And I started reading it, and I was really blown away. Someone who put some thought into sermons, his concise and powerful teachings really, really spoke to my heart. And I said, this is a person I want to learn more about. And so, I follow him on Facebook. I'm not a big social media user, but he is a very powerful voice on Facebook. I actually don't have any of his posts in our sources. But in general, when you teach modern Jewish thought and contemporary Israeli rabbinic leaders in the kind of religious Zionist modern Orthodox community, you actually have to include their Facebook posts because that's one of the ways that they communicate thought leadership in Israeli society. And he has a recent post about the drafting of the ultra-Orthodox into the military, which got 3,600 shares, meaning 3,000 people posted it on their own Facebook pages. That's just a glimpse into how broad his reach is and how powerful the writing that he does is in the kind of public square. So that is, just a little glimpse about that. So I followed him, and I got another one of his books, which we're going to look briefly at, which is this book called Torah Shel HaNefesh, the Torah of the Soul. Again, we'll talk more about them in a few moments when we open up the source sheet. He has a third book, which was published a year ago, which I don't have my hands on yet, but we'll just touch on at the end. What speaks to me about Rav Ilay is he has a really humanist, compassionate attitude towards people. He's a deeply learned person, and he's extremely approachable and relatable. I find this through his writing, and I find it in my personal interactions with him. He's someone who's deeply immersed in Israeli society. He's not closed off. When I was in Israel post-October 7th, I'm trying to remember even what the particular moment was on the trip, and I turned on the radio, and there was Harav Ilay Ofran being interviewed on an Israeli radio station about some topic or another. So he's really a media personality, in the sense of someone who shares his voice with the greater Israeli public. I think very much in the model that Rav Avi often speaks about of, I'm an Orthodox rabbi, but I'm not only a rabbi for Orthodox Jews. He would define himself as an Orthodox rabbi, but as someone who wants to reach and connect with people of all backgrounds. That speaks to me very much. And his unique combination, as the kind of title of our learning today, of psychology and Torah, is something that speaks to me very much. So, there's lots of ways to learn more about him. Again, pretty much all in Hebrew, but one of the amazing things of technology today is you could take, for example, he was interviewed not that long ago in Makor Rishon, a major Israeli newspaper. You could, open up that page, copy all the text, and paste it right into Google Translate, and you could get a very accurate rendering of it into English. So even for those who are not Hebrew readers, it's really possible to kind of put the Hebrew text now into translation tools on the internet and get a really good English translation as a way of accessing more of his writings. And for those who are interested in more, I'm happy to share some of the recent interviews and articles of his that have spoken to me. Okay, I'm now going to share the source sheet with those who are on Zoom. Please feel free, if you want, to pop questions into the chat to do so. And again, I apologize in advance for monopolizing the teaching and conversation this morning. We want to really get a chance to see as much as we can. So for those who are looking at the source sheet on Zoom or those who have it in front of you, I titled this A Fresh Voice of Psychological Torah, a few key biographic points. It blew me away to know that Rav Ilay is younger than me. He was born in 1982 and grew up in Yerushalayim. He's a rabbi, a psychologist, and social media personality, as I said. I feel a kindred spirit in the sense that we learned in the same two yeshivot in Israel. He did his kind of integrated army service while he was learning at Yeshivat Ma'ale Gilboa, and then post-army learned for a while in Gush in Yeshivat Har Etzion. I did it in the reverse order. I did my post-high school year in Yeshivat Har Etzion, obviously no army service. And then during my rabbinic studies, I took a year off from Chovevei and went to Israel and learned in Yeshivat Ma'ale Gilboa. So same set of influences. We were not at any of the institutions at the same time, but drew from the same well springs of Torah and institutions in Israel. He's a graduate of Bar Ilan, where he studied Talmud and psychology, and then got a master's in psychology at Academic College of Tel Aviv. Since 2009, so also just kind of appreciate the parallelism. I started at the Bayit in 2008. In 2009, he became the Rav of Kibbutz Yavne, and in 2017 founded a Mechina Kedam Tzva'i, a pre-army program, amongst the different ways that people balance army service and Torah study for those who want to balance those things. There is the Hesder program where you interweave your army service and your Torah learning and do 5 years total, where it's almost 2 in the army and about 3 in yeshiva. Another approach for those who want to do the full 3 years of army service, but also learn, is to do essentially like a gap year, 1 year of learning in yeshivot in Israel that are particularly geared to do a preparatory year of learning in anticipation of army service. And so he founded one, which is at Kibbutz Be'erot Yitzchak, called Ruach HaSadeh, co-founded it with another kind of co-rosh yeshiva, and that's been around since 2017. Interestingly, he is the grandson of Professor Yeshayahu Leibowitz. It seems to me that their thought could hardly be more different, he and his grandfather. Maybe almost kind of reminds me of Rashi and the Rashbam, who were also grandfather and grandson and had such, not complete opposites, but very different approaches to their commentaries on the Torah. So in 2 generations, a lot can change. But certainly I would say the influence of his grandfather in terms of someone who approached Torah with a deep philosophical lens is something that they have in common. So we're going to try to understand Harav Ilay a little bit through glimpses into some of his writings, in particular his books. So the first book that he published in 2018 was this one called Torah Shel HaNefesh, the Torah of the Soul, Misipurei HaMikra El Nivchei HaNefesh, from biblical stories to the recesses of the soul. And what I have here for you is actually the table of contents, just so you can get a glimpse of how he does this. The background, lots of people attempt to understand the Torah, biblical characters, etc., through using the tools of psychology. What I think Harav Ilay does, a little bit differently in this book is to kind of really lift up the psychological tools. In other words, it's not just in the background, but what he does in every chapter, and each of these lines represents a chapter, and the chapters are not long. They're, probably average about 10 pages. What he does in each chapter is he has an opening page where he talks about a particular psychological concept or tool. In so doing, he quotes lots of people who are familiar to us, Piaget, Freud, Kubler-Ross, and others, but he also quotes people I had never heard of, psychologists and researchers of psychology like Beck, Mahler, Marsha, Greenleaf, people I never heard of. And he introduces a concept in their own thought, spends a page really that could be a page out of a psychology textbook, really just focusing on the psychological research and theory on its own. And then he has 10 pages where he'll analyze a biblical story, theme, or idea and apply the psychological theory or tool to it. So it's really about the synthesis of psychology and Torah. In the introduction to the book, he talks about the fact that on the face of it, psychology and Torah feel like opposites. The goal of the Torah is to tell you what to do and how to do it. Psychologists want to understand you and your motivations. A psychologist or therapist who tells you what you're supposed to do feels like it's the opposite of their job. Their job is to help you understand yourself. The Torah's job is to motivate you or guide you to action. So on the face of it, they feel like opposites, but his suggestion is that, of course, ultimately they can inform each other powerfully. How can we effectively carry out the Torah if we don't understand ourselves and how we relate to its laws, its teachings, and its values? So he sees them as, yes, almost, as profoundly different and potentially contradictory, but he wants to, utilize the two of them in harmony. So we can just skim here the table of contents. So he has a whole section on developmental psychology, ranging from topics like the story of the Garden of Eden and psychosexual stages, to Moshe's staff as a transitional object, right? Transitional object, the idea in psychology that, in times of change, little kids like to have something with them. This totally happened to, I can't remember which of our younger 2 kids this year had a little toy that he would bring with him to school every day in the beginning, weeks of school. And then he would hold it all day long. And then later, a few weeks later, he would bring it, but then he would put it in his cubby. And then came the day where he said, I don't need Pinky Minky anymore. I could just go to school without it, leave it at home, forget it. So the concept of transitional objects is a very well-founded psychological concept in developmental psychology. So Moshe's staff as a transitional object. We have a section on psychoanalysis, humanistic psychology, where you can see a whole range of topics. Cognitive psychology. How does the psychology of science help our understanding of the ethical challenge of Akedat Yitzchak, the binding of Isaac? Why, how come, and NLP, that's neuro-linguistic processing. That's the concept of understanding how our brain kind of analyzes the world in order to understand our own reactions to things. Social psychology, including Aharon's sin and Kubler-Ross's stages of grief. Psychopathology, behavioral science, including the lineage of Amalek and xenophobia. How do we relate to strangers? And then his conclusion. And the conclusion of the book is called The Torah as a Rorschach Test. I didn't have a chance to actually translate that last section and include it on the source sheet, but I want to excerpt from it kind of freestyle for you now. So you don't have it on the source sheet, but I'm going to just read. Yes, Ruby, a quick question.
Translated into English?
Yes, none of the books are translated into English yet. I'll mention by the by that this past week at the YCT summer kollel that I'm participating in, we had a visit from Rav Benny Lau, another one of my favorite, modern Jewish thinkers, rabbis, and community leaders. And he said, we were talking about, in what ways post-October 7th, the connection between American Jews and Israeli Jews has been strengthened, and in what ways the gap has widened. And he said one of the things that preoccupies him, he said, in the end of the day, the language gap is very real. Yes, I speak some English, and yes, you speak Hebrew, but in the end of the day, most of us are not truly fluent in both. And he said the reality is, when I see an article or a long Facebook post in English, I tend to dismiss it. It takes so much effort to read serious writing in the language which is not my native tongue. And I have the hunch that the same is true for you. If you see a serious halachic article that's 20 pages long and it's written in Hebrew, it's not going to make it to the top of your reading list. And he's right about that. And he said, one of the most important things we can do to build the bridge is if you, my American, colleagues, are writing something of importance to you that you believe is important, have it translated into Hebrew. And I, myself, he said, Rabbeinu said, I make the commitment that when I write things that I think are important and I really want to share, I'll make sure that they're also translated into English. So that's by way of saying it's a loss that Harav Ilay's books have not yet been translated into English. I haven't yet discussed this question with him. But I hope even just the little excerpts on the source sheet are a contribution to that project. So in the very last chapter, the kind of epilogue, in a sense, or conclusion to the book about psychology and Torah, he talks about religiously motivated violence. When people cause violence in the name of religion or God. And he talks about the fact that a person can look in the Torah and they can see lots of calls for peace and and conflict resolution and things like that, and also lots of motivations or calls for war or the death penalty or things like that in the text of the Torah. He says, in many ways, the Torah is like a Rorschach test. You can sort of see in it almost anything you want to find. Not absolutely anything, but almost anything. And one of that poses a great challenge. A person can typically find support or opposition for almost any political or theological idea in the Torah, if you quote this text or if you quote that text. And so often, the choices of the texts that we quote are not a reflection of the truth of the Torah, but of our own biases. And we always have to be aware of that we're reading the Torah with the lens of our own perspective in the things that we highlight. And he brings an amazing example. When after a Nazirite completes their Naziritehood, they bring a series of offerings. And one of the ones that they bring is a sin offering, a korban chatat. Why do they bring a sin offering? And the Gemara cites two opinions. One opinion says they bring a sin offering because they denied themselves one of the pleasures of this world. A Nazir is not allowed to drink wine. and they did the wrong thing by denying themselves wine even for a short period of time. And if a person who denies themselves wine is called a sinner, how much the more so a general ascetic is called a sinner. Comes along, this is Rabbi Elazar HaKapar, comes along his colleague, another Rabbi Elazar, and says, but elsewhere it says that a Nazirite is called holy. And so why does he bring a sin offering? Because he stopped being a Nazirite. He should have been a Nazirite as long as he possibly could. Being a Nazir is a holy thing. And if a person who denies themselves, even who kind of stops Naziritehood is called holy, how much the more so a person who denies themselves not just wine, but all the pleasures of this world. An ascetic is called holy. And so this is an example that Harav Ilay brings, that you can prove opposite things from the same passage in the Torah. And this is one of the great challenges of being readers of the Torah. It's not a morally relativistic text. It has worldviews and opinions, but so often the texts that we choose are a reflection of our own values, and we have to carry that awareness. And part of what psychology helps attune us to is how we know what biases we bring to the text, and to be aware of that. Yes, where it says, if turn it because everything is in it. And in the very, very end, this is going to bridge us from his first book to his second book. The very, very conclusion then of that kind of the last page of his conclusion actually is almost word for word one of the first pages in his introduction to his next book. So I'm going to go back to share. Okay, so his next book, as I mentioned, is called Drushim. It's a collection. It was published in 2021. He became, as I mentioned, the Rav of Kibbutz Yavne in 2009. And so he was there for 11 years or so before he published this Drushim. And he writes in the introduction to this book, the challenge of being a rabbi who gives sermons. And how do you find, that he said, my knees still tremble every time I go up to deliver a drasha, because, what meaning am I imparting, and how am I honorably discharging the responsibility to interpret the Torah and apply its lessons to our everyday lives? I take this, very, very seriously. And I kind of carry, he says, 3 ears with me when I try to interpret the Torah and deliver messages to our community. And this concept, what you have here in source 2, as part an excerpt from the introduction to Drushim, which has, as I mentioned, 2 of his sermons that he gave over the years in Kibbutz Yavne, 2 from each of the weekly Torah portions. The way he describes the kind of 3 ears that a person should have is it's almost copied from the very, very last page of his prior book, The Torah of the Soul. So this is sort of like the through line for him, I think, in both how do we aware of the fact that the Torah can say almost anything. How do we interpret it faithfully? How do we listen to the Torah attentively and listen to our own selves attentively to know what's coming from the Torah, what's coming from ourselves, and how we synthesize those things? Is sort of also the kind of approach we have to the world, and the way he tries to hear in order to create the sermons that he gives. And so here is what he writes in source 2. For the whole person, again, this is my translation. For the whole person, such did I receive from my teachers. 3 ears are needed. To be an Adam Shalem, a whole person, you need 3 ears. One that is attentive to the word of God, a second that hears society and the world around it, and a third that heeds the inner voice that bursts forth from the depths of the soul. You have to hear God's word, you have to hear society, and you have to hear your own inner voice. Few are the people that have only 1 ear. Those that know how to hear only themselves are generally called egoists, egotistical. Those who now know how to hear only the voice of society are communists. And those that hear only the word of God and that alone are generally called fanatics. Most people have 2 ears. Those that are attentive to themselves and society, but whose ears are closed to the divine voice. Those that make the effort to hear the Torah and their society, but are not interested in any inner voice. And those that hear the inner voice and the word of God, but trample without attentiveness the society that is around them. In my sermons over the years, I have tried to manifest all 3 voices to help enlarge and sprout that missing ear, right? Since he says, as most people have 2 out of the 3, but it might be a different 2 for any different person. My goal is to manifest all 3 and to help bring out and create flourishing for the missing ear, whatever that one is, and to strengthen the auditory sense in each of the 3 ears to help everybody hear better their inner voice, the voice of society, and the voice of the Torah, the voice of God. These sermons represent a seeking of a living Torah, which is connected to the world outside and the world in the inner soul. It is a Torah of seeking and a Torah that seeks. And here he's playing, every time he talks about a sermon, he's using the word drasha. Now he's playing on the word drasha. A Torah shedoreshet v'nidreshet. A Torah that seeks and a Torah that demands, that seeks God and that nidreshet makes a claim from the human being. A Torah that actually asks something of us, right? And that's, again, where Torah is different from psychology. It doesn't just describe the world around us, but it asks something of us. And that's part of the kind of play on the title of the book, Drushim, which means kind of something is asked of us. And it's also a play on drasha, sermons. And sometimes we call a sermon, a drasha or a drush. So it's a sort of play on this seeking, interpreting, and a claim being made upon us. So timely for this week is Parashat Balak, and I'm bringing you one example of Harav Ilay's, sermons. And what I love about this one, it's a great exemplar of his writing. Starts with a kind of, an ear that listens to society, a noticing of the way people behave and what their reality is. Then it kind of comes to the Torah. It hears the message of the Parsha. What is the Torah actually telling us? And then it sort of ends with kind of the charge to really hear our own inner voice and then also the voice of the other. So it really feels like it hits all the jobs of what he's trying to do in a really short. These are all short. I think if they were delivered, they'd probably be 6 minutes long, something like that. These are not lengthy sermons. And that's, I think, part of what makes them so powerful. And they often begin with a sort of social comment, a Torah idea, and then a message, and always, I think, very psychologically astute. I not to demean, actually, this is a compliment in the other party. In certain ways, some of his openings remind me of Jerry Seinfeld, who I think is like someone who, in his comedy, really notices people and the way we act in the world. So here we go. He writes, "Why do drivers honk at a traffic light? The famous joke goes, traffic lights are the only place in the world where the speed of sound is greater than the speed of light. Even before the green light appears, the car behind you has already begun to honk. In our dominant driving culture, a car with the chutzpah to slow down or stop will most likely merit a proper honk. And as every Israeli knows, it generally doesn't end with honks. Shouts, curses, and other forms of violence are usually part of the package. But often, after a long and aggressive moment of honking, it becomes clear that the driver stopped because of an accident, a crossing pedestrian, a pothole, or some other logical reason. In truth, a reality in which a driver stops inexplicably with no reason is seemingly quite rare. The main reason why the driver from behind honks with impatience is that despite their limited field of vision, and even though it is clear that that driver does not know what is happening in front of them, they never raise to their mind the possibility that the driver in front of them sees something that they don't see. They assume that if they themselves do not see a reason to stop or slow down, then presumably there is no such reason. And from here, the path to the aggressive solution, the honk, the curse, and the shout, is quite short. A similar thing happens between Bilam and the donkey. Bilam hits the donkey over and over with vigorous blows, simply because he never imagines the possibility that it sees something he doesn't see. Only after God uncovers to his eyes, I should say, the divine messenger blocking the way, right? That Malach Hashem, who is blocking the path that the donkey can see and Bilam can't see. Only after God uncovers his eyes to it does Bilam understand his mistake. Just like a moment after the honk, the elderly person crossing the road slowly appears, and suddenly the justified cause for stopping becomes clear. Bilam's acknowledgement of his error, Chatati, I sinned, Kilo Yadati, because I did not know that you were standing opposite me on the path. which is said to the divine messenger blocking the path, is the rare occurrence in which the person who behaved the way they did because of not seeing the whole picture actually acknowledges this, right? Usually what happens, you're honking, then you see, oh, they stopped because, there was a person crossing the road. But do you shout, sorry, I didn't realize? No, you just go on your way. So Bilam represents the model of someone who falls prey to the typical short-sightedness, limited field of view that we all deal with and that we, don't take into account when we have the strong reaction that we have. He's the rare person who actually acknowledges his mistake after making that common mistake. An incomplete view of the picture and the negative consequences of a vision like this are a repeating motif in the Parsha. When Balak wants to cause Bilam to curse Israel, he seeks to show him a partial picture. Right? This is what Balak says to Bilam a couple of times in the Parsha. Go with me to another place from where you can see them. You will see their edge, but not their entirety. Efes katsehu tireh, v'chulo lo tireh, and curse them for me from there. This is the way of those with a critical eye and those who curse. The whole picture is usually balanced and nuanced. The desire to curse blinds the eye and causes the perceiver to see only its mere edge, the edge of whatever it is that you're cursing or criticizing. Now he goes to his big application. The main reason, and this feels to me very, very broad. I don't know if I would totally agree, but it's a strong statement. The main reason for most events of violence in the world is the inability and the lack of kind of correct approach to understand the perspective of the other and to internalize that the world looks different in their eyes. Things that you see from there, you cannot see from here. I think the words are Dvarim sheroim misham, lo roim mikan. Yankala Rotblit, the Israeli rock and roll singer and songwriter, spanned many decades, once wrote, because it is possible that the person opposite me is behaving the way they are behaving, not from evil and wickedness, but simply because they see a reality that is not visible from my perspective. Empathy and the attempt to enter the shoes of the other and see the world from their perspective are the corrective to most aggressive acts on earth. Violence always begins from a human's being persuaded that they see the whole picture, and that it is not possible that from the perspective of another, the picture looks a little bit different. From the assumption that I am a prophet of the Lord and the other is simply a donkey. Right? That's the blindness, short-sightedness, limited viewness that we carry around with us, that so often is our downfall and the downfall of the people that we are encountering, whether personal, communal, national, international. So I think it's just a great glimpse into a typical Torah of Rav Ilay, a social comment, an application to the Parsha, and then a broader message and an insight, starting from an understanding of human psychology. Okay. How does this play out? So Rav Ilay, of course, is a rabbi. He's not someone who only teaches Torah in the sense of, sermons and understanding of, biblical texts, but he is a halachist. He's a rabbi of a kibbutz. He answers halachic questions, and he's part of the halachic discourse of the religious Zionist and broader Israeli community in the world today. And since, over the last 15 years or so, he's been a participant in that conversation, I think with increasing strength, getting his voice out there. So we're not going to have time to go through this in depth, so I'll try to just sort of touch on it. One of his famous halachic rulings that stirred up a lot of controversy was something which maybe to many of us sounds quite obvious, but is actually a real area of halachic debate. And that is touching between spouses during childbirth. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn off the share for now and just kind of describe his essay to you outside without going through it, because I excerpted it for you, but it's too long to attempt even to read through the excerpts. But just to explain what he does here. As always, he sort of starts with this is an article which he wrote in a halachic journal and Journal of Jewish Thought called Deot in 2015. And as always, just not just to sort of grease the wheels, but because of that core message that he shares, that you have to have your ears to all three things: Torah, your own inner voice, and society. He doesn't just sort of start in with the halacha, but he starts in with context and culture, and talks about the fact that there was the reality show which depicted the live birth of babies, and kind of couples and how they experienced it. And one episode had a religious couple who didn't touch during the labor and delivery. And there were all kinds of reactions to this. This was in popular culture, appreciating the strength of this couple to follow the halacha, criticism of them, they didn't understand the halacha, or maybe it's a Jewish law, but it's a crazy Jewish law. How could you follow it? All kinds of discussion. And he analyzes the different kinds of reactions to it. And he says, for many people, there's a gap between what feels to them from their intuition, from their values, even from Jewish values, the right thing, which is the possibility for supportive touch between a husband and a wife in a time of childbirth, and the halacha. And he says, is there a way to bridge this gap between the inner human need and the, halachic ruling? And he goes through a halachic analysis, and he points out basically that we have an area of leniency in childbearing women that we say for yishuv hadat, in order to cause them a settled mind, in order to relieve anxiety, stress, hysteria, depending on what the situation is. We allow all kinds of things. We allow not just to save a life, right? We certainly always know to save a life, you can violate all kinds of otherwise Torah prohibitions. But even for emotional comfort, yishuv hadat, we allow all kinds of things. And he details some of them. For example, one of the significant ones, if you have two hospitals you could deliver at, one is closer by and one is further away, and the delivering mother prefers to deliver at the further hospital. On Shabbat, if she goes into labor on Shabbat, can she go to the further hospital? Of course, to ensure her health and well-being, she's allowed to drive in the car or do whatever she needs to do to get to a hospital. But can she go the extra 10 miles to the further away hospital? If each of them is going to healthily and successfully deliver the baby, what is the grounds to allow extra Shabbat violation just to go to the hospital that she prefers, right? And yet the halacha is clear that she absolutely may, because this causes her emotional calm, and emotional calm, not just saving a life, but emotional calm allows you to override biblical prohibitions. Driving on Shabbat is a biblical prohibition. Allows you to override biblical prohibitions on Shabbat. And he says a husband touching his wife is at, so we just, of course, the background here, when a woman goes into labor, and exactly when is a debate, but when a woman goes into labor, she enters the status of nida. And husbands and wives touching during the status of nida is not allowed according to the Torah. Now, is it a biblical prohibition or a rabbinic prohibition? There's lots of discussion and debate about that. Some would say even biblical. And Rav Ilay says, but we allow all kinds of other biblical prohibitions for the settled mind and comfort of the childbearing mother. Why do we not then allow a husband's emotionally supportive touch to his wife for the exact same reason? And he says, to me, it's clear that it is allowed. But if you survey the halachic literature of today, people either say it's not allowed, or they say under extreme duress, if the woman is going crazy, we would allow it. But even then, the husband, writes one rabbi, should put on a latex glove to reduce the level of the prohibition, and that's how we address it. And Rav Ilay, says, I absolutely believe, based on the arguments that I've made, that for the emotional comfort of the woman, it's 100% permissible. Why, though, do our rabbis strict here if I've made a compelling argument? And he, suggests that we have anxiety over sexual contact, And that risk is something which kind of provokes anxiety amongst halachic decisors more than other areas. This, by the way, I'm not even going to get to go into this here, but is actually an area, sexuality is an area that Harav Ilay writes a lot about and has published on a variety of topics related to it. This is one example. And in his analysis, he really talks about kind of psychology of halacha and understanding kind of what are the risks of being strict, where one can be lenient, including the idea that if we're strict here, then we don't differentiate between different kinds of touch, sexual touch, emotionally supportive touch. And ultimately, he sort of concludes this is an instance in which part of the motivation to be lenient is to minimize the gap that people feel between halacha and their human needs. If we can find a lenient position, it's actually important for people in their relationship to halacha to feel that halacha matches their human needs where it's possible. So this is a little bit of an example where we see kind of psychology and halacha come into play in Rav Ilay's writings. Fascinating, generated lots of discussion and debate. And in fact, this leads to one other related writing about halacha, which I want to share. So we're going to now turn to source 5, and I'll share my screen again. Rav Ilay has an essay, which I didn't include any excerpts from here, on kind of when is it good to be strict and when is it harmful to be strict. And he doesn't take he doesn't, and consistent with his approach, which is nuanced and not sort of, monolithic. He says there are absolutely areas in which there's a religious, spiritual, psychological value to being strict. And then there are other areas where there is a religious, spiritual, and psychological value to being lenient. And one has to be thoughtful about that. He wrote an article in 2017 called Ne'emanut lahalacha, loyalty, faithfulness to halacha in our age, in this age, between formalism and essence. And here he talks at length about two dimensions of halacha: formal halacha, kind of the kind of black and white ruling of what one is supposed to do and not supposed to do, and the essence of halacha, what we might call the spirit of the law, the underlying reasoning, explanations, motivations for the law. And he says there is a growing gap between them. Often, the law is one way, but if you really look at the reasons might push you to a different bottom line conclusion, but yet the law is what it is. How do we bridge that gap? And he writes, this is the conclusion of this article. This is source 5, sought to point out the growing gap, bottom of page 6 on the source sheets, in the world of halachic law between formalism and essence. A gap that puts the person who wishes to observe the Torah in front of an absurd choice between the halachic ruling and between its reason and its depth. There are many ways to bridge and reconcile, refine, and soften the gap, and some of them have been reviewed in detail in this article. Which gives a variety of instances in all directions. For example, he says, he talks about selling chametz. He says selling chametz, in the kind of formalistic dimension of the law, it's absolutely something which can be done for anything. You can sell a half a box of Cheerios before Pesach. You can sell, your whole business before Pesach. You can sell all kinds of chametz before Pesach. But what was the real reason why this developed was primarily, economic, for people who would lose their livelihood if they couldn't hold on to the chametz that they had. But the real Torah's vision, wherever possible, is not to sell your chametz, it's to actually experience the elimination of chametz. If you have a cupboard full of chametz, but you sold it to someone else, you didn't violate owning chametz on Pesach, but maybe you actually missed out on the spirit of the law, which was to go through the process before Pesach of eating up and eliminating any of the chametz that you have in your house. So this is an example where he actually says, there's an absurdity to the sale of chametz sometimes. And, maybe it's an example, often we think about it sort of towards the lenient side, that the underlying reasons of the law should motivate us to be more lenient. Here's an example where he says we have to really think about Do we need to re-understand this law? How do we experience the gap between the fact that I sit down and go through this transaction and kind of wave this magic wand of halacha, and now I walk back into my house, which looked the same as it did 2 weeks ago. I still got the pretzels in the cupboard and everything, but now it's fine for Pesach. Is that the experience that we really want to have? And how do we manage the slight feeling of absurdity of the gap between the formal law, which allows us to do this, and the underlying vision, which is that somehow we actually want to experience a chametz-free environment on Pesach? He says, I've given a variety of ways to kind of bridge that gap, and some of them even conflict with each other. And we shouldn't necessarily just choose one, but we need a flexible approach, offering a different solution to different issues. Beyond the way, second to last paragraph of this source, beyond the way of dealing with the difficulty in specific halachic issues, I think we must expand the meaning of the concept of keeping halacha, so that includes not only the formal ruling, but also the reasoning and the reason given in the Talmud, as well as the spiritual agadic space that the sages included in the spiritual space of a mitzvah. Often when the Talmud talks about a mitzvah, it will include stories about rabbis and how they related to the mitzvah, or interpretations of texts that don't have to do with the exact strict letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. And we have to factor those in when we think about it. And when we say, I'm shomer mitzvot, I keep the Torah, it doesn't just mean the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law. We must adapt the understanding that keeping halacha is much broader than the details of the laws, but at the same time, it cannot exist without them. We don't want to just become spirit of the law people. We also have to be letter of the law people. Strengthening the connection between the technical and the content is the key to solving the problem, according to the enlightening words of Rav Kook, with which he ends. The main point of learning Torah for its own sake cannot be reached except through the preparatory step of understanding and the feeling that comes with it, how all details of Torah are beloved with a precious sacredness, and how the general light full of life and bringing life to the world permeates all the details. We want to study Torah and halacha with an understanding that it has its final bottom line, but it also has its motives and its ideas and the stories that surround it, and that all of that, those things are supposed to all be interrelated and impact the way we live a halachic life. The book that he wrote, I'm going to go 5 more minutes. The book that he wrote most recently is called L'Nevuchei Ha'olam HaChadash, for the perplexed of the new world. Of course, you hear in there, with an intentional choice when he uses the word L'Nevuchei for the perplexed. It situates his book in a history that began probably before, but maybe significantly starts with Rambam's Moreh HaNevuchim, Guide of the Perplexed. And over the years, others have written, books that use that word. It's sort of a code word, a keyword for a major work of Jewish thought, which attempts to grapple with tensions between Judaism and modernity in a certain sense. And that's exactly what the book that he worked on now is all about. And I'll just share. We'll skip over source 6. You can look at it on your own. It's kind of I think it may be even the book jacket, the abstract of the book. And I'll just read a short review of the book in a journal called Hashiloach that was written in February 2023. When I think about kind of Rav Ilay's development, obviously this is a little bit, overgeneralizing, but, he studied psychology. And it kind of starts, I feel, in a certain sense, in developing his voice with the intersection between psychology and Torah, where he's sort of explicitly starting with psychology. Start with the social science field, and then applying psychology to Torah. Then his second book is his Drushim, where he kind of like leans into sermons in their own right, his Torah voice. Then he continues, and some of these things were earlier, his halachic writing. And I think it's sort of, you have to reach a certain age and stage before you write a Moreh Nevuchim, really a broader work of Jewish thought, and an attempt to really tackle the bigger problems of our time. And that's this third book, called For the Perplexed of the New World. And here's a little bit of the review. The author writes, Ofran, who is a kibbutz rabbi, head of a seminary, and also a psychologist, lists 10 challenges, the challenges of the modern time, presents each of them in detail, and offers for each one a what can be done section, which is usually a kriyat kivun, a call to a direction, meaning it's not a set of prescriptions, but it's sort of like a direction of thought and potential action. The challenges are partly new situations in society, usually Western or Israeli society as a whole. The other part are longstanding problems in the religious world, which the current reality, the reality of the ocean of information, exacerbates and highlights, what we call the digital age. Such is, for example, the gap that exists in a legalistic religion such as Judaism between formalism, the law and its details, and essence, right? So that essay which we saw, he kind of reprises as one of the major challenges of today. But challenges like this also go beyond the borders of religion, because if we stick to the last example, this is an important problem in the legal world as well. In constitutional law also, you have tension between, the bottom line law and the reasons for the law. The interesting thing is that the challenges of this time identified in the book are mostly positive phenomena, the result of the progress and improvement of the world, or the result of the maturation of culture. Such are, for example, the victory of family over ideology, cultural democratization, which is expressed, for example, in the improvement of the status of the child and the student, or secularism as a meaningful value alternative. In other words, these things all describe positive developments in our world, but that still pose a challenge to a religious life. The chapter on this last matter, secularism as a meaningful value alternative, begins with a diagnosis that is easy to agree on. While in the past, when society as a whole was religious, abandoning religion was also a departure from the boundaries of social morality. For hundreds of years already, morality has also existed separately from religion, right? There was, once a world where, religion was almost synonymous with morality. And if you left your religion, you became an immoral person. Obviously, that's a broad generalization, but it was sort of religion and immorality were almost the poles. But now we have secularism, which is deeply moral. We have morality independent of religion. The continuation of the chapter will perhaps arouse less agreement. The sexual morality in the general contemporary Western society, or more precisely, the sexual morality marked by the wings of political correctness, seems to the author to be equal in value to the religious one, if not superior to it, meaning he actually sees something in modern Western sexuality that he feels as equally valuable to religious sexuality view, if not superior. In his estimation, this is one of the sources of the not necessarily negative attraction of the secular world on moral, religious young people. The secular world has competing moral models that moral, religious young people are enticed by. The author, from his point of view, suggests as a direction for a solution to sharpen and emphasize the connection between the Torah and the Torah observers and interpersonal ethics. Usually, the positive side in contemporary realities that created the challenges is more obvious and will be agreed upon even by a conservative reader. In fact, the book is conservative par excellence. It recognizes both good and bad in cultural progress and seeks within such a world a path to preserve the tradition it threatens. For this purpose, one can emphasize certain elements of a tradition more than others, and one can even adopt new ideas from the environment. But the goal is the inheritance of tradition and identity, meaning the book, in a sense, aims to preserve Jewish tradition, traditional Jewish life, but by, integrating or responding to the positive developments of the world around us. From the same positive side that Ofran finds in the challenges of the time, he is sometimes original in finding the points of difficulty in them, meaning sometimes he has an insight into something challenging or problematic in our world, which we wouldn't necessarily always notice ourselves. He tends to find it precisely in the blessing inherent in these challenges. This is the case, for example, with regard to the internet and the smartphone. Usually in religious educational discussions, the epidemic of exposure to pornography is immediately mentioned here. But Ofran locates in this field a fundamental problem that, in his opinion, changes man's situation for the worse. And it lies precisely in the blessing created by the ease of communication. The fact that we can kind of access everything through technology is not the problem of that the first problem of that for him is not that we can access bad stuff, but it's rather because a generation is growing up here that gets used to not solving any problem by itself, not trying to acclimate. Anything that's hard or you don't understand, you can look it up and find the answer, a how-to, a what to do, a resolution to every challenge you can find in the information superhighway. And we lose the capacity to work on solving and resolving issues on our own, a kind of a unique take on one of the problems of the information age. An original diagnosis interweaves several chapters of the book and also touches on the condition of man in our time. It is not trivial especially for a period that is allegedly associated with a spirituality that cuts corners. Rav Ofran recognizes in our generation a tendency not to try to create harmony in all dimensions of life, to align the generations and find some comprehensive answer, to be in a state of rest that Freud called anastasis, but rather to live out of recognition of the gaps and contradictions and the difference between what is desired and what is found, and precisely to grow from it. Even though in certain places he says we have to sort of synthesize and harmonize, he also says one of the challenges and capabilities of this generation is the capacity to live in contradiction. This bearing of conflict is one of three foundations for a new religious language that the author details at the end of his book. So, we just touched the surface, and hopefully we got a chance to see some of his own words and some of the writing about him. I will try to see if I can get a good translation of his Facebook post about ultra-Orthodox in the army, because it was one of his really, really timely contributions to a very timely topic. So feel free to write to me if you would like a copy of that. And again, happy to share for those who want the Hebrew originals of the different things that we saw here. And hopefully this teaser piqued your interest in someone who, again, is truly a contemporary and a colleague. I think an amazing Torah leader and thinker from our kind of allied and sibling communities in Israel, someone who has a deep psychological wisdom, insight, and intuition, and brings that to the way he thinks about Torah, halacha, Jewish philosophy, and Jewish life. Happy to take questions for those who want to stick around. Anyone who needs to sign off or go.
Rob Stephen, can I?
Yes, Teddy, please.
I'm going to make two comments. One is the example of the car stopping at the stoplight.
Yes.
I actually use that a lot in my classes in terms of it is a classic example, and my comment is that it's like that sometimes you can't change someone's reality.
Yes.
Even if they can see beyond, some people don't want to see beyond.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes.
And
it's
I guess what I'm
interesting.
referring to now is the conflict, with different cultures in terms of Hamas and Israel. And totally, how do you negotiate or come to an understanding with people that are resistant or totally do not want to see past, their own reality?
Yeah. Yeah.
And the second comment, I love this author because he really is bringing in contemporary issues and making and trying to understand and bring it in within the perspective of the Torah. So it really opened my eyes to a new person that I could actually. I'm looking forward to his readings.
Great, thank you, thank you. I'll comment just on the first thing that you said about, how do you speak to people who, willfully or not, refuse to look beyond their own perspective. That's obviously a massive problem in our world today. And on a couple of occasions, actually, I've seen him write, and he mentions this in the article on touch during childbirth, and he mentions it in his post on ultra-Orthodox in the draft. He says basically, I recognize the limits of my vision and my comments. I'm not speaking to X, Y, or Z populations because I know they can't hear what I have to say. But my hope is that my words will be heard by those who are open-minded and have the potential to change. So sometimes that is the reality. I remember very soon after October 7th, we had a shul member kind of talk about how do we engage in conversation with people in our workplaces and things like that. And he sort of talked about these sort of you map people out on sort of two axes of kind of I can't remember exactly how he described them, but part of it was, are they open at all to hearing? And if they're not, he just said it's not worth it, it's futile, and you just focus your efforts on people with whom you can have a conversation. It's a painful reality, but when we accept it, we can be productive with our efforts wherever they are. So
Rob Stephen, I just want to say my son taught me a lesson. He said, don't engage.
Right. Sometimes that is absolutely the best approach. Bert, please.
Two things. One directly pertaining to what you just said is that I have Psak Halacha from Rabbi Go Lincoln who obviously would never be listened to by the Hasidic people, but about exactly the same subject.
Yes.
Recent Psak Halacha. Have you seen it?
About spousal touch during childbirth.
No, about the Hasidim in military.
Oh, interesting. No, I haven't seen it. Please do send it on. Be interested.
Okay, you just totally off topic. The question that I have is there sort of like a compendium of all of the, for example, what the Bahag stands for, or SMOG, who is it? What does it stand for? And when was he hogging or whatever you want to call it?
Meaning just about biblical commentaries. They're kind of
Well, not biblical commentaries, halacha commentaries.
yes,
It's
yes. I'm sure there exists, they're usually broken down by time period, but there's a range of books that, explain, yes, what does this, acronym stand for? Who were they? When did they live? Yeah. Follow up with me offline. I can recommend a couple books.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Great.
Um,
All right. Vivian, please.
yes, you really can't know exactly what's going to happen, and you have to be dependent on what is written and what the psychologists are saying, and generally follow the one that most appears to reflect your own definition of the psychology and how they view things and what conclusion they come to, and it always hope that it's going to work out well, and with a belief in Hashem, you say, Hashem, you make this come out right. Just let this come out right, and you give your tefillot and your prayers and your hope, and look at all these wonderful people who are defining all of this, and say, okay, I'm going to go with this, and I'm going to be stern with this, and I'm going to do my tefillot and do all the things that I'm supposed to do that I've learned from the time I was a little girl at home, and my father was davening there, and I would be watching that or walking along with him while he was davening.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Thank you, Vivian. Thank
I
you.
get that, and that's in me, and I'm not going to try to change my life at this point. So I would go along with that.
Beautiful. Yes, there is we do need to approach as much as we can with a modicum or more than a modicum of trust and faith and reliance on our tradition and the, models we had growing up. Please God, they were good ones like yours. And thank you. And I just want to say how wonderful, Vivian, it is to see you and to get to learn with you. So thank you. Any last comments before we wrap up? Great. So next week, we'll be reading and discussing Henrietta Zold. I'm very excited about that. My parents live not very far away from Zold Avenue, which was my first learning about Henrietta Zold, and so inspired by our local street, excited to delve into her thought, her story, and her impact on us today. That'll be next Thursday. And wonderful to learn with everybody. Thanks for being here. Thanks for those who joined us in person. A special treat.
Thursday or Wednesday? Thursday or Wednesday?
I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm so used to saying Thursday. No, next Wednesday. Absolutely. Yes. Thank you for that reminder. Yes, Wednesday. Wednesday at 10, just like this week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
No, it doesn't.